This is The Last Laugh. I'm Matt Wilstein from The Daily Beast, and today on the show, you know him as an actor from films like Orange County and TV shows like Fargo. He is also an accomplished director of 3 excellent documentaries, including his latest, John Candy, I Like Me, which is available to stream right now on Amazon Prime Video. Colin Hanks, welcome to The Last Laugh.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I just got to see the documentary about John Candy, who I was a huge fan of growing up and really loved it. So I just kind of wanted to start with, why did you want to make a movie about this great comic actor, John Candy?
Well, I definitely felt like there should be a John Candy documentary that exists.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what that was. And I remember talking with when Ryan Reynolds approached me about directing it. That's pretty much what we both said. He said, I don't understand why one doesn't exist already, but I feel very strongly that it should. And I said, I agree with both of those statements. I concur. But it wasn't until I sort of was able to speak with his children, Chris and Jennifer, and really sort of understand sort of the struggles that he had and learned more about his personal story growing up in outside Toronto. All of that I just thought was really engaging and really interesting, as well as, you know, people's deep love and passion for John. You know, I just felt like it was it seemed like a good story to tell.
Yeah, the film opens with Bill Murray, who raises this sort of fundamental problem that the film could have had, but I think overcomes, which is that nobody has anything bad to say about John Candy. He really comes off in the film just as an incredible guy, without the sort of, you know, skeletons in the closet that come out in some documentaries of beloved people like this. Was that something that was on your mind before Bill Murray raised it in that interview? Was it something that you were worried about? What's the conflict of this movie going to be because he was so beloved?
Well, I mean, there was definitely a component of that. I knew that the documentary just couldn't be just a laundry list of here are all the movies that he made and he was a great guy. Those were the things that I already know. A majority of people who do know John Candy already know that stuff. Maybe they wouldn't know about, you know, specific things within SCTV or whatever, but I knew that there needed to be something more. There needed to be something there. And, you know, generally speaking, you know, a lot of times, you know, documentaries about actors or whatever, it's sort of about the hidden demons that they had or the struggles that they had, you know, with drugs or alcohol or, you know, whatever. And, you know, John being such an everyman, you know, everybody sort of like would see him and just think, oh, that's like us. You know, he's a good guy. He's, you know, genuine. He's kind. That's who I want to. That's, you know, how I want to be. But it turns out that his struggle was all much more common than we sort of realized. You know, once I found out that his father had died when John was incredibly young, and that John had just started to do sort of the deep dive in therapy, you know, before John passed away. That sort of struck me as very common and very interesting and wanting to sort of explore, you know, how that affected him throughout his life. And that to me seemed like, regardless of how many people are going to, you know, say what a great dude he was, you know, I know that there's not going to be a whole lot of like, quote unquote, dirt, but right. Wanted to be able to still come up with something that was, you know, that was engaging and passionate and all of that. So that was sort of the general goal. Yeah,
I assume you didn't uncover any dirt that didn't make it into the film.
No, not really. I mean, the biggest sort of revelation that we had was that, you know, he had, you know, tried to enlist in the American Army. That was about as
interesting.
Yeah, as big as it got. Yeah.
We do see him wrestle with different demons throughout his life, including, you know, his weight, which he was known for. And you have this footage of interviewers asking him these really uncomfortable questions about that. And there's even a quote from his wife that really struck me. She says, "The industry wanted him big." That was sort of like his identity. And once it was, whether he wanted to lose weight or not, it didn't really matter. That was his brand or who he was in the industry. Why did you want to include those clips from those interviews? And what do you think it said about, maybe how culture has or hasn't changed since the time when he was, at the height of his fame?
Well, I mean, there were a couple of things I found that was really fascinating. One was that, John was having issues with stress and anxiety and had begun to seek a therapist at a time when that was not necessarily very common knowledge. It wasn't really part of the national or cultural conversation the way that it is now. So that in and of itself, I thought was really sort of fascinating. But then the other thing that has changed is the way that people communicate and talk about subjects like weight, mental health. People have a much better understanding of how these things actually sort of affect all of us. And people have a much better understanding of how not to approach those conversations. And so I was really blown away by how uncomfortable John was in his interviews, especially the early ones. And it's because of, the onslaught of, frankly, like really horrible things that people are asking him in the form of, isn't this a fun interview? And there was something about that was just so heartbreaking and sort of crushing. And I think it sort of hopefully it gives the audience an understanding of the kind of thing that John was constantly coming up against in his career, but more importantly, in his life. This is something that affected him.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that you do see how uncomfortable he is. And that's also, a contrast to his on-screen confidence and his persona on screen was so often like the guy with the most charisma, the guy who couldn't sort of unflappable. So we do see that side of him that, he was still in public in these interviews, but it is a much more vulnerable side of him that I don't feel like I had really seen before. Did you feel that too?
No, I mean, absolutely. It's odd, but like I just assumed that the happy-go-lucky John Candy that I remember in my mind from the movies would be the happy-go-lucky John Candy in interviews. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't the case. And that was a big indication for me that we were kind of on the right track in terms of sort of the themes that we wanted to explore. Because the truth of the matter is that nowadays we have these conversations. It's not necessarily a taboo subject to talk about mental health. And, people's sensitivities in regards to how to ask, just ask questions, be polite and be kind. It was just jaw-dropping to me that was considered okay back then, that people didn't really bat an eye. And there was just something about that I thought just really captured, what John's experience was. And I thought it was really important that that be part of the film.
I think it's in one of those interviews that John Candy sort of casually mentions that John Belushi had tried to convince him to join SNL or be part of it at some point, which is not something that I knew. Do you know more about that? Did he turn it down, or was it something that he
I'm not 100%
do?
Clear. No, it wasn't to be a cast member. I don't think it was to be a cast member. It could have been to host. But I know
he never hosted either.
He did host eventually. He did host once. But it could have been about maybe joining the cast or auditioning. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Because I was thinking about the anxiety element of it. I think that's something that's been talked about much more recently. People like Bill Hader have been very open about it, or others.
Oh,
of the
absolutely.
anxiety of being part of a live comedy show.
Yeah, I mean, because, the Lonely Island guys just, they did their digital
Yeah.
all about that, and we actually had sort of toyed a little bit with that idea, that sort of contrast, because obviously Saturday Night Live and SCTV are sort of like these two sort of cool kids at the table, but they're very, very different. And there was something I thought that was kind of interesting about the anxiety of SNL versus the sort of a little bit more laid back culture and the difference of SCTV and how they made it. But it turned out like really it was just more interesting just to talk about SCTV and show some of those old sketches.
Yeah, SCTV was taped, which is the big difference in terms of anxiety, I'm sure, as they were able to kind of perfect things. And I know they sometimes filmed very long hours to get things right as well. Yeah. How do you think John Belushi's death affected John Candy? Because that, there's sort of this lineage that John Candy is in with Belushi and then, Chris Farley later, of these guys who died too young and were these, big personalities. And
well, that, that was, when I was sort of initially trying to think of an overall theme of what the film could be about, at the very, very early stages, the sort of very gut reaction was, think of sort of quote unquote overweight actors, that died too young. You think of those three, and two of them died of drug overdoses.
Right.
But ultimately, and Dave Thomas speaks to it a little bit in the film, I think Belushi was a signifier. Obviously they had worked together. They all ran in the same circles. They knew each other well. And, Dave Thomas says like that was a sign that, the good times can end. They were no longer just young kids having fun, going out into the world and making names for themselves. It was now, there were consequences to, the way that everyone lives their lives. And I think ultimately that really affected John. Loss is a thing that was very prevalent in John's mind a lot, ever since the death of his father. And so I have no doubt that was really a big, big alarm for John, as it was for a lot of people at the time. It was a big shock.
Yeah, you deal with this idea of approaching and then either surpassing or not the age of that your parent died. I think John's dad died at 35, and
correct.
John made it, further to he was 43 or
43.
And I know you've talked about sort of approaching the age that your mother died at 49. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, my mother died at 42. I'm 41 right now, so it's also something that's on my mind.
Yeah.
And so I know that was something that was on your mind, making the film. So how do you think that played into, both John's story and how do you think about it?
Well, first and foremost, I'm sorry that we're in the same club. A lot. I don't know if it's necessarily in a completely conscious way. I think some of it is really sort of subconsciously. It's always kind of been on my mind the closer and closer I get to that age. Just because I can't believe that I don't feel that age. That age seemed so like distant when I was younger.
Right. Yeah.
And to think that I'm getting to the point where it's like I've lived the same amount of time that my mom lived. There's something about that just doesn't compute, and that really I connect with that. That really resonates with me. The same way that I'm a big believer that a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people, once they reach around 40. They really kind of start taking a harder look at their lives and what's gotten them to to that point. And, more often than not, it's through therapy, whether they're trying to understand something or trying to change something, what have you. And John was just about to start that work, had just started that work and was just starting to make those insights. And so, like, to have those two things combined, that's what my experience is right now. And so there was a lot there that really landed with me. And look, my day job is to wear makeup and pretend to be other people for a living. That's my job as an actor. And I am able to put a lot of different stuff into that work that is fulfilling and artistic for me. But with the docs, I find that I'm able to really truly explore ideas and themes in a much, much deeper way. And, when those two themes popped up, that I was kind of drawn to exploring that, even though, everything in my body said, don't, you're sort of like not wanting to do that. But, the last documentary I did about, the Eagles of Death Metal and the Bataclan attack, like that was a whole exercise in, I don't want to be doing this, but, leaning into that uncomfortable feeling to sort of see what comes out. So this was sort of an extension of that to a degree. You
do have obviously a personal connection to John Candy. He played the brother of your dad, Tom Hanks, in Splash. I think that was one of my earliest encounters with John Candy, probably after Home Alone and maybe Uncle Buck. But I think Splash is really John at the pinnacle of his charisma. I loved the detail about SCTV people seeing his character Johnny Toronto in that character, which was sort of a bit I guess he did even off screen. Did you meet him at that time when he was doing Splash with your dad?
No, I met him during Splash, and then obviously he was around also during Volunteers. No, I have very, very vivid memories of John when I was growing up, and Macaulay Culkin sort of speaks to this in the film, but he really did have a way of connecting with people, and it didn't matter how old you were, and so. That was my experience. Even as a kid, John made me feel, important. He made me feel seen, heard, understood. And I have very vivid memories of my exchanges with John. And it's not because, oh my gosh, it's John Candy, the actor. It was really just, here's, this guy, John, who's a really incredible, nice guy. And he also just happens to, make movies, with this other guy that I know. So, that was, again, I think like one of those instances where I knew, all the people that we spoke to about the film, I knew what it was that they were talking about because I had experienced just a little smidge of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that interview with Macaulay Culkin is really heartbreaking in a lot of ways, where he's talking about his dad, and everything we know about that relationship, and how John Candy really did serve as a surrogate father and sort of saw him in a way that his own dad didn't when he was becoming famous. What did you, I think it was very important, obviously, to get Macaulay Culkin's voice in this film, but what did you make of that interview with him, conducting it and seeing what he had to say?
Well, the truth of the matter is with every interview, you really don't know what it is that they're going to say. Obviously, you have a general hope and a general idea of an arc that you want to get the interview subject to talk about, so that it can, you can find ways to incorporate it in the movie, but you never really know. And with Mac, there was, I was a little bit concerned because I was like, well, how much is he going to remember? Like, how much was John really present? He was
so young.
He was so young, and this isn't even Home Alone. This is before Home Alone. So He's even younger. And so I really wasn't sure what Mac was going to say, but the things that he sort of illuminated, not only about John's character, the kind of person he was, and the connection that they had, but then also specifically the connection that John had with John Hughes and the relationship there. All of that stuff, there's no way that you can really account for that kind of stuff because you don't really know what they're going to say. But it's really exciting when you sort of land on something and they open up the way that, they do. Like Mac just opened up and let us in, and I think really sort of showed us not only an important side of John, but just incredible insight in that I probably wouldn't have thought even possible to be in the movie.
Were there people that you wanted to get to interview that you couldn't get? You got a lot of incredible people in the film, but were there people you tried for?
Well, what's funny is I remember very early on when I was, debating on whether to take the project on, Marty Short said, no one's going to say no. And that's going to be a problem for you. And he was right. No one really said no. Pretty much everyone agreed. The only issues were really just more about scheduling and everything else. Everyone we're talking to, very famous people, very, very busy schedules. So it was really all just about the logistics, this, that, the other thing. Ryan was the one that was able to somehow land Bill Murray. Yeah. And you could probably make a documentary just about that. But
he had to go to. I know everyone has to go to great lengths to get Bill Murray to do anything, right?
Yeah. So Bill and Dan, those were hard ones to nail down.
Yeah, just Dan Aykroyd is still great in the film. Yeah.
Just schedule wise, but pretty much everyone said yes.
With documentaries like this, there's also, the archival footage is a huge part of it. Was there a piece of footage that you found that you just couldn't believe existed, or that you were able to include in the film that you were excited about?
Yeah, so much. The Candy family were incredible and gave us complete access to everything that they possessed. I mean, literally everything. I mean, we've scanned, high school report cards and, home videos, Super 8 footage, you name it, we were able to track it down. So there's, it's one of the things I love about docs is there's a component of like treasure hunting almost, which is really fun. I was really excited when we were able to get some of the improv outtakes from Home Alone. Those are great. That was a big bucket list thing. I was really wanting to get that. And then we did track down the lost planes, trains, and automobile scene, the big monologue that he had to Steve Martin that they ended up cutting down. So I was able to track that down. So I was actually able to watch it, which was pretty cool. I understand why why the entire speech didn't make it into the film. The way that they cut it in the finished product, I think was the right call. Just from a sense of it just landed a little bit more powerfully, but it was still a really amazing thing to see John's performance, especially given how Steve Martin, how it affected him, even just thinking about it, in his documentary.
And that's where the title of your film comes from, is "I Like Me," is that, that famous line from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Yeah.
It's one of, I think a few speeches and moments in these films. There's another one in Splash that you include where he's talking about, no one will ever love me exactly like I want, where he was able to go deeper and sort of, he's known for his sort of slightly broader comedy, but he had this really intense pathos too. I was just listening to Bill Hader talk about when he saw Planes, Trains, and Automobiles as a kid, he was like, "Oh, well, that's who's going to win the Oscar this year for best actor or best supporting actor." Like, he thought there was a no-brainer, and of course, he didn't realize that the Academy does not exactly celebrate comedy the way that in comedic films, the way that some of us might like. I think that's even true, for your dad as someone who didn't, started out in comedy, didn't receive Oscar attention until he moved into dramatic work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an opinion on that? Do you think that comedy doesn't get the respect it deserves at the
absolutely
level?
Without a doubt, without a doubt, 1,000%. It doesn't necessarily have that same sort of I would say I don't want to say value, but but this is the thing about John, right? So everyone remembers, for those that remember John, they remember how funny he was, and they remember how John made them feel. And the way that he made them feel was through his performances. It wasn't just that he was funny. When you talk with people, they don't say like, "Oh, I thought John was so funny." They all said, "Oh, I love John. Like, I love John Candy." That's because he was truly an actor. He was really, truly giving a performance every time. And it didn't matter if it was, really broad or not. It was nuanced. There was a specificity to everything that he did that I think really landed with people, and is why 31 years later we're talking about him now, because he was that good. And it's a shame that people don't look at comedy the exact same way as they do the big sort of dramatic, quote unquote, important pieces. But as the old saying goes, is dying is easy, comedy is hard. So it's just sort of the way it works sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah. Did you think about that when you were starting out in acting, sort of whether you wanted to be more in the comedy world or the drama world? Or you've done so much of both. So did you just feel like you wanted to do it all? Or?
Yeah. I mean, it was a little bit, for sure. I think for me, it was also just because I came up pretty young, in the sort of still like teen WB world. It wasn't so much like, let me try and get away from comedy. It was more, let me try and get away from this kind of genre of movies and sort of start telling more, sort of, adult stories. But, I mean, even with some of the comedies, for sure, because, I think as actors, there are two things we're constantly thinking about. When is the next job? And what is that next job going to be like? What do we hope it's going to be? And you're always wanting it to be great. You're always wanting it to be, something spectacular. And sometimes you got, a comedy about a guy, having to go to work, like that's kind of just the way that it works sometimes. But yeah, I mean, there was so much about, a lot of the stuff that John talks about in the film and that we explore. There's a lot of that I relate to, yeah.
I think you probably had to contend with the whole Nepo baby thing before that was a known term that anyone was using. I saw that your dad sort of pushed back on that idea in an interview a couple years ago, but it's not something that I've heard you talk about. So I was curious just what your perspective is on that conversation.
Well, no one has actually asked me about it, so this is the first. But I will tell you right now, I have absolutely zero interest in contributing to that conversation.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, that while I think the some of the points may be structurally valid, I don't agree with the tone of it, and overall, I just think. All right, you want to call, I'm 47 years old. You want to call me a baby? Like, come say it to me directly.
So now I want to do our segment called The First Laugh. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about firsts in your career. Starting all the way back as a kid, the first piece of comedy that you remember making you laugh really hard as a kid growing up.
I remember there was a film. It was called My Favorite Year. that I remember watching on VHS all the time, and that movie made me laugh so hard. Peter O'Toole playing an old drunk actor doing a live variety show in the early 50s, and there was just something about that movie and his performance. I just howled with laughter.
Do you remember the first time that you felt funny, that you could make other people laugh?
No. I don't.
Hasn't happened yet, or you're just not sure when it was?
Yeah. I mean, you could make that argument. It hasn't happened yet. Perhaps, maybe. I don't know. I'm always amazed when people can pinpoint that exact thing. I don't know exactly when it was. But maybe that's just because I got so high off of it that I went blackout and I don't remember.
That must be it. On IMDb, at least, your first movie role is That Thing You Do. I have to tell you, I don't remember your appearance in that, but I'm curious what you remember.
I was in fact, I was in a scene that got cut. So I'm one shot. I escort Liv Tyler up the stairs at the Hollywood Television Showcase.
And your dad directed that movie, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's tough to get cut out of the movie by your own father. That's
what a lesson right out of the gate. Hey, kid.
Do you think he was trying to teach you a lesson with that? Like, I'm going to put him in the movie and then I'm going to cut him out.
Oh, no, that didn't need to be in the movie. Simple as that. The scene didn't work, didn't need it.
It's real kill your darlings kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, exactly.
Do you have an audition story from your career that stands out to you, either because it went really well or it went really poorly, or just when you think about auditions that you've been on, what comes to mind?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a whole other story right then and there. I mean, I think you just gave me an idea for a podcast. Too many. I mean, so many. In fact, there's a lot of times where I'll be flipping through the channels and I'll see something and I'll be like, why do I know this? Oh my God, I auditioned for this movie. That's right. I forgot. Oh, that's the scene. There are a ton of them. All of which are embarrassing and all of which I never want to bring up in a public forum.
Well, what about, did you have an audition that you really nailed, that you were excited about?
There's definitely been ones that, look, it's the unglamorous part of the job for sure, but it still can be fun. It's the part of acting that we really truly do for free. It's a chance to be like, hey, you want to act a little bit today? Here you go. Here, audition for this. And sometimes that goes really, really well and you get the part. Sometimes it goes really, really well and you do not get that part for whatever reason. And the same goes for the bad, auditions. And so you just learn to just appreciate the moment that you're able to just audition and read. And then if anything else comes from that, that's all out of my control. And if it happens, it happens.
Outside of being an extra in That Thing You Do, what was the first part that you did book that you were really excited about, and what do you remember from making it?
That would have been Roswell, pilot for Roswell. I remember going out on that audition. I was still, very, very new, very, very green, but got the part and went and filmed the pilot. And it was a really exciting time. It was, kind of thrilling in a way and also terrifying. But would have been Roswell, pilot for Roswell.
Is there something in your career when you look back that you said no to that you now say, ooh, maybe I should have said yes to that?
Oh, there's so many of those. Yeah. There's so many of those. Yeah. I think, I don't know if you want detailed answers for all of them, but yeah, there's definitely a few where I just go, God, get your head out of your ass. What do you just go on that audition? Go do that.
Can you share one or details about about one of them.
Win a Date with Tad Hamilton. That was one. You know, the irony is that sometimes it's not even because they were like big hits. Right. Although that was a successful film. I just wasn't in the right headspace. You know, to be honest, I had lost my mother, you know, within that year, and that was just not the headspace that I wanted to, you know, be in and make a movie. So I politely said no, thank you, yeah, that was just the way that worked out. But, you know, the only reason why I say that, and there are other ones too, you know, Devil Wears Prada is another one. It's just that I realize now, you know, every actor, regardless of what it is, if you have an opportunity to work. Just do it. Just do it. It's, you know, worst case scenario, you're going to be reminded of it, you know, on television once every few years. You know, worst case scenario. And even that's kind of nice because it's a little snapshot of, you know, of where you were, you know, at that point in your life.
And also probably a lesson that you don't know what's going to be successful or not successful. You don't know what's going to be good or not good.
I fought so hard. I wanted the role in Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium more than you could possibly imagine. I was devastated when I did not get that role. And, you know, and then it became, and then it was a DVD and an episode of Breaking Bad, you know, so.
Well, yeah, you could have been in that. Yeah, then maybe you were almost in Breaking Bad.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That was as close to almost being in Breaking Bad as I ever got.
The flip side of that question, is there anything you said yes to that you now kind of wish you'd said no to?
No, not really. Because I've come around to that idea of just like, look, you know, you always try and do your best. Sometimes you can, sometimes you do, and it's just not in the right thing, you know, and stuff, you know, just doesn't go, you know, your way. And it shows you, just how unique and just how special it is when you're in something that actually is good, that people like, you know. People think that it happens, you know, every day, all the time, but that's not the case. So, you know, if you're ever fortunate enough to make something, well, that's a gift. That's amazing, you know. So I'm a big believer in that.
I thought you were fantastic in Fargo, the series. Is there a story or memory that comes to mind from making that, looking back on it now, that it really stands out?
Okay, yeah, I'll give you one. Auditions. Speaking of auditions, there, you know, I could tell you a lot of stories about shooting in the cold and all of that stuff, but there was there's this thing that I don't do it all the time, but every now and again, it's kind of nice because it used to be really, now it's mostly on Zoom, but, you know, it used to be you'd go into a room and there's like 5 different people and you're reading and, you know, yeah, you're excited to do the acting, but there's a million things that are making it really uncomfortable to perform, most of which is just meeting people for the first time, knowing that they could do their job. And so I would always try and come in with some sort of like, just joke, just something to just break the ice, just whatever, just to, you know, make it feel a little bit more casual and not so stiff. And I had to prepare an accent for Fargo, obviously. And so I came up with this thing where I said, all right, so I prepared an accent, but I'm warning you right now, it's kind of somewhere between Chicago and Canada, eh? And if you give me the job, I promise I will whittle it down to Minnesota. And that was the joke. And I'm not saying that joke is the reason why I got to play Gus Grimley, but I don't think it hurt.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Do you have a story or memory about the first time you met one of your really big comedy heroes, someone you just really looked up to and meeting them for the first time?
Wow. Well, Orange County was like filled with a lot of those kind of people. There was, Chevy Chase and Lily Tomlin, Catherine O'Hara, who played my mom, who I've now worked with officially on 3 movies, if you include this one. And that was always a real treat. But to be perfectly honest, the one that I was most excited about on that movie was Jack Black. And this was really, it was before School of Rock. It was still, sort of very early days in his, major motion picture career. But I was such a diehard Psycho fan of Tenacious D in college. Yeah. And I, knew all of the songs and just thought, it was absolutely hilarious. And so I was really excited to meet Jack and get to know him. And, he is exactly how you hope he's going to be. He's literally,
he lived up to expectations.
He's the exact same guy, for sure. And, I was really sort of tickled that we were able to sort of strike up a friendship and have been friends all these years. So yeah, that was a big one. But, that one was, wasn't like this comedy idol. It was just somebody I really thought was funny. I really admired, that was kind of close to my age.
Right. Yeah.
That was really it. There was just, so it had a little bit of a different kind of like cachet almost, because it was kind of like the cool senior,
Exactly.
So cool. Yeah.
The question that we end every episode with: is there a story or memory from your career that makes you laugh now, but really was not funny when it happened?
Oh, geez, man. So a story now that makes me laugh now made me cry when it happened.
Or just didn't necessarily make you cry, but was upsetting in some way or wasn't funny when it happened.
Well, I mean, Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium?
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Pretty good. That's pretty good.
Yeah. I think I already answered that question. So yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one, but look, that's the hope, right? You want that, because if you have that, that means that you've been lucky enough to have a career, and you've been lucky enough to work, and you've been lucky enough to work in a lot of things. And I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to consistently find ways to work, and it's all been in different avenues, whether it's television, movies, comedy, drama, and now, directing documentaries and who knows what else will come down the lane. But, I'm just so fortunate to be able to do this. So yeah, I'm sure that there's a whole lot more of them, but I don't think any of them has a better title than Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium.
Well, Colin Hanks, thank you so much for doing this. John Candy, I Like Me is available to stream right now on Amazon Prime Video. It's such a wonderful, uplifting movie in so many ways, and I hope people get a chance to check it out. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.